Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're taking a really deep dive into the universal life cycle of workplace dynamics. Whether you're just clocking in for your very first job or you're a seasoned executive sitting in the corner office, there are these invisible rules that govern your daily life. We're going to trace this entire journey, starting from everyday workplace harmony all the way to that headline-making absolute peak of conflict.
Okay, let's dive into this by starting right at the very edge. Ask yourself what actually happens when a workforce drops their tools, walks out the front door, and goes on strike. We see it on the news all the time, right? But how does a professional environment actually reach such a massive breaking point? Well, in this explainer, we're going to reverse engineer that extreme climax. We'll take a journey to understand exactly how a workplace functions, how it fractures, and we'll look at the strict legal frameworks that either prevent or manage that ultimate breakdown.
So, here is our roadmap for today. Section 1 covers the basics of industrial relations. Section 2, the power of trade unions. Section 3 looks at collective bargaining. Then we hit Section 4 when things go wrong, followed by Section 5, taking industrial action, and finally Section 6, resolving disputes.
Let's jump right in with Section 1, Basics of Industrial Relations, setting the baseline.
Now, the ultimate goal of any workplace is peace and productivity, which is officially called industrial harmony. Industrial relations is the actual system that ensures this happens. It's essentially the rule book that regulates the relationships between business owners and workers, making sure there's clear communication, fair treatment, and really strict rules for discipline. Ultimately, it's the framework designed to protect absolutely everyone from unfair exploitation.
But maintaining this harmony isn't just a simple two-way street. It's more like a three-way intersection. Looking at the framework in Malaysia as our prime example, we see what's known as a tripartite system. So you have the employers on one side, you have the employees on the other, but balancing the two of them is the government. Through really specific legislation like the Industrial Relations Act of 1967 and the Code of Conduct for Industrial Harmony, the government steps in as the ultimate referee. They control and guide how these workplace relationships operate to ensure neither side exploits the other.
But what happens when employees need a stronger voice? That brings us to Section 2, Power of Trade Unions, Organizing the Workforce.
A trade union is essentially an independent association of workers combining their voices to regulate relations with their employer. And what's super fascinating is just how relatively simple it is to get one off the ground legally. Under the Trade Union Act 1959, you actually only need a minimum of 7 members to form a union. You just fill out a registration form, hold a meeting to record the minutes, and submit the whole shebang to the trade union department with a really modest 30 ringgit duty stamp. Just like that. And, well, maybe after surviving a tiny bit of classic government paperwork, a collective voice is legally born.
Now, keep in mind, not all unions look the same. They generally fall into 2 distinct categories. An in-house union is highly localized. It represents workers within a single specific company. Think of the employees at one particular manufacturing plant. On the flip side, an industry-based union is much broader. Picture a National Transport Workers Union, for example. This represents workers from multiple different companies, all united simply because they work in the exact same industry or occupation.
So why do people actually go out of their way to join them? The reasons are super relatable, honestly, and they range from the purely economic to the highly personal. Primarily, workers join to gain bargaining power. They want to secure better wages, better benefits, and protect their employment rights. But it's also very much about solidarity. A lot of people join for the social aspect or to find opportunities to demonstrate leadership skills that might actually get them noticed for future management roles. And sometimes it's just plain peer pressure from your coworkers on the factory floor.
Because this right to organize is so incredibly fundamental, the law provides really robust protections for union members. An employer absolutely cannot prevent a worker from joining a union by, say, sneaking a weird condition into their employment contract. They literally cannot refuse to hire someone, deny them a promotion, or threaten to fire them simply because they are a union member or participate in union activities. The law essentially guarantees freedom of association, creating a really strict shield against employer discrimination.
Let's move to Section 3 and see how this builds. Section 3, Collective Bargaining, Negotiating the Terms. Collective bargaining is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's a formal negotiation process between the employer and a recognized trade union to figure out the terms of employment. We're talking things like wages, benefits, and work hours. But here's the catch.
For this to actually work effectively, the union needs genuine bargaining strength. They absolutely must be officially recognized by the employer, they need adequate financial funds to run their operations, and most importantly, they need members who are deeply united and fully support the union's decisions.
The whole process kicks off when either the employer or the union officially invites the other to bargain. Once those negotiations begin, it really splits into two distinct paths. Ideally, both sides reach an agreement, and that leads directly to the signing of a contract. But if they fail to agree, that triggers a dispute. They then have to complete a very formal dispute resolution procedure before they can even think about resuming negotiations.
When those negotiations are actually successful, the big outcome is the collective agreement. Now, this is not just a casual handshake deal. It is a highly formal, legally binding written contract that gets signed by both the employer and the union. Crucially, by law, this agreement must specify a duration of no less than 3 years, and it has to be officially deposited at the industrial court. What this practically does is effectively lock in workplace terms, and by extension, workplace peace, for a minimum of 3 years.
But of course, what happens when that peace breaks down? We are now entering Section 4, when things go wrong, the escalation of conflict.
It usually starts really small with something called a grievance. In the world of industrial relations, a grievance is just an individual worker's specific complaint against their employer. And these are highly relatable everyday scenarios. It might be an employee who feels they were unfairly passed over for a promotion, maybe someone who feels their outstanding work is going completely unappreciated, or a worker who feels management is exaggerating a super minor mistake just to punish them.
Organizations handle these grievances through a very strict escalating procedure, and it usually works in blocks of 5 days. So, an employee first raises the issue with their direct supervisor. If it's not settled in 5 days, boom, it escalates to the head of department. Another 5 days go by, it goes straight to the CEO. And if the CEO can't settle it within 5 days, the matter can finally be referred to the Department of Industrial Relations for government conciliation. It's like a ticking clock. So, the absolutely crucial point here is understanding the difference between a simple grievance and a trade dispute. A grievance is just an individual fighting their own personal battle. But it becomes a formal trade dispute the very moment the union steps in to officially represent that employee or the whole workforce against the employer. This usually happens when those internal talks fail or when there's a massive clash in opinions. Think of a scenario where the union demands a 10% salary increase and the employer stubbornly refuses to offer anything over 3%. At that point, the conflict is completely institutionalized. If a trade dispute remains entirely deadlocked, we arrive at Section 5, taking industrial action, the climax of conflict.
The most common form of action you'll see is picketing. This is designed specifically to be highly visible. Employees will display banners and placards right near the workplace to communicate their issues to the general public and, let's be honest, to embarrass the employer. However, the law puts some really strict fences around this. Only workers who are directly involved in the dispute can actually participate. Furthermore, it absolutely must remain entirely peaceful. The very second picketing involves any kind of intimidation or violence, it immediately loses its legal protection.
Then, we have the ultimate, most severe action, the strike. A strike is a calculated refusal to work or a purposeful, coordinated slowdown of production by a group of employees until their demands are finally met. This typically happens for one of two main reasons. Either the employer outright refuses to negotiate during collective bargaining, or the company implements sudden, massive changes, like unannounced layoffs and retrenchment, which forces the workers to push back by withdrawing their labor entirely.
But listen, you cannot just walk off the job on a whim. The legal procedures to initiate a legal strike are incredibly rigorous. First, the union has to hold a secret ballot for its members, clearly stating the issues at hand. To actually proceed, a massive 2/3 majority has to vote yes. Then, the union secretary has exactly 14 days to send those results directly to the government's Director General of Trade Unions. And even after all that, they still have to wait out a mandatory 7-day cooling-off period before the strike can physically begin. It is a highly regulated, very deliberate process.
Now, when a workplace hits this absolute breaking point, it obviously can't stay there forever. That brings us to our final part, Section 6, resolving disputes, bringing it back to peace.
And this brilliantly illustrates the step-by-step path of external intervention. First up is negotiation, which is the ideal scenario where the two parties just figure it out internally. If that fails, we move to conciliation, where a government officer steps in to advise. Though, keep in mind, they can't actually force an agreement. Next is mediation, calling in a trusted, totally unbiased outside leader to help bridge the gap. And if all else fails, the whole thing ends in arbitration. This is where an impartial third party, specifically the industrial court, examines all the evidence and makes a final, legally binding award that both sides are absolutely forced to obey.
So we've seen how the rules of employment form this incredibly delicate ecosystem. And it really brings up a fascinating thought. If absolute workplace harmony is the ultimate goal of industrial relations, is a strike a catastrophic failure of that system? Or, given all the strict regulations surrounding it that we just talked about, is a strike actually a designed, necessary legal pressure valve required to force a fair resolution? It's a dynamic tension that exists in almost every single workplace around the world. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and we will definitely see you on the next one.